Responsible finance is timely now for a number of reasons. If we look at the consequences of the global crisis, we can see that it would have been very helpful to have had more responsible behavior on the part of lenders. And the subprime practices and products weren't the whole cause of the crisis, but they certainly were part of the tinder that got the fire started. So that's one factor, is that we can see the consequences not just for consumers, but for financial institutions and whole financial systems of products and practices that are irresponsible. But another reason actually comes from the success of microfinance itself. Microfinance is growing rapidly in many parts of the world, and as markets get more competitive, there can be a temptation and more pressure to cut some corners in terms of how clients are treated. And sometimes measures in terms of how many loans you're making and on what basis, in terms of how loans are collected, shortcuts in terms of what kind of information you give to clients, how much time they have to think about the offer, pressure for them to take up different financing offers. This is the kind of behavior that we see that can develop in rapidly growing and more competitive markets. And the pressure to build market share, to keep up with your competitors that may have fewer compunctions about their behavior, all of this can contribute to making this timely. I think the sector is trying to be proactive and get out ahead of the issues. I mean, honestly, if we look around the world, we don't see massive evidence in the microfinance sector of abuse of consumers. It's more a chance that this is the time for us to take stock and make sure that our practices and products are defensible, and that a sector that was created in order to benefit poor people is actually doing so. So people sometimes ask, where is this coming from? Are there particular events in the microfinance industry that have led to this growing interest and action around client protection and responsible finance? And I think often they have in mind the Compartamos IPO, the situation in India a couple of years ago where there was a great deal of consternation on the part of policymakers and particularly politicians around interest rates. We look at Nicaragua, where there's been a debtors movement at times supported by the government to encourage low-income people to not repay these loans. These types of events may have heightened the interest, but one of the things I think it's important to understand is that actually 5, 6, 7 years ago, practitioners and their national and international networks in microfinance started to get together to articulate codes of conduct, principles of appropriate client protection. And this resulted in a real wealth of materials that were a great starting point now for the current campaign that's underway. So we have the example of national microfinance associations in India, Mexico, Uganda, and other places that came up with codes of conduct speaking both to how their members, who were retail microfinance providers, should interact with, respect, and protect the interests of clients, but also how their members should respect the rights of other providers. So it's very interesting examples of provider-provider principles and client protection principles at the same time. We have the Microfinance Network and the CGAP network that also carried out work in this area. And what it meant was, at the point that we were ready to work on responsible finance and client protection in a refocused way over the last year or so, and with a particular emphasis on implementation, moving beyond the codes, there was a great deal of consensus already around what were core principles of client protection, and it gave us a really good starting point. One factor that definitely has raised the profile of these issues in the field, in the media, and in the general public's eyes has been undoubtedly the firestorm of debate that was set off by the Compartamos IPO in Mexico. So that definitely stimulated a lot of discussion about whether this was an example of capitalism gone too far at the expense of poor people. It raised issues of not just transparent pricing, but fair pricing. There were suggestions that the kinds of practices there might almost be characterized as abusive. So I think there's been a very healthy debate as a result about how do we manage and how do we respond to commercialization trends in our industry in ways that still can be characterized as responsible to our clients.